You're good.
Hello, everyone, and happy Friday. Happy December 2021. Thanks for joining us for this Section 504 webinar on supporting students who are on the autism spectrum. I'm Holly Bell. I'm the Student and Family Rights Specialist for the Utah State Board of Education. And I'm going to introduce my colleagues here in a moment, but let me just do some general housekeeping items. So if you have to hop off the call and need to watch the rest of this webinar after today, then you can do that. If you want to receive credit for watching this presentation today, we'll have 1.5 licensure points. Then there's going to be a Google form for you to fill out, and we are going to send that out through the 504 listserv and also post it on the 504 page on the Educational Equity webpage. And so you can access this recording for a month. Well, actually, you'll be able to access this recording indefinitely on the YouTube channel using the same link that you used today. But if you want to get relicensure credit for today, then you have a month to either fill out the Google form after you watch this training, or watch the rest of the training after, or hand it out to your friends and they can watch the training for the next month and submit the form. So with that said, then I also wanted to tell you that I am building a Canvas course for those of you who have been participating in these webinars over time. I've been doing these for 3 years now. If you've been attending these, I'm going to build out a Canvas course so that you will be able to get 0.5 USB-E points, or not credits. So this is towards level changes in your district. And so after we complete this one, I'm going to get that Canvas course together, and hopefully I can send that out to you in the spring. So I don't want to spend any more time. I'm going to give you my email at the end of the presentation. So if you have follow-up questions, feel free to email me. And I'm always open to hearing ideas for other webinars. So now, without further ado, I'm going to first pull up the PowerPoint. Okay, Kathy, Tanya, can you see it? Thumbs up. All right. So let's meet the team. You've met me. Kathy, will you introduce yourself?
Certainly. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. Thank you so much for your participation today on this really important topic. My name is Kathy Davis, and I've been serving as the Suicide Prevention Specialist here at USBE since 2015, I believe. And this subject is really near and dear to my heart. I really want to advocate for all populations, and especially those that struggle on the autism spectrum. So I'll turn the time over to Tanya.
Hi, everybody. Thanks from me as well for attending today. I am Tanya Semerad, and I work in the Special Education Department at Utah State Board of Education as the Autism and Significant Cognitive Disabilities Specialist. And this is my 32nd year in my educational career, and all 32 years of that have been with a heavy emphasis on serving students and their families who, are on the autism spectrum, or working with their child with autism, supporting teachers. I mean, this has been my life's passion. I do work in special education, and as I talk a little bit more through the presentation, of course, I definitely understand that it's not just in special ed that we're talking about students on the spectrum. So I'm really, really happy that I get to work with you guys today and share some information. And I really appreciate Holly and Kathy for what they'll be sharing as well.
Thank you so much, Kathy and Tanya. I always love including my colleagues who know more than me. So I appreciate you joining us today. One more thing, as you probably notice on YouTube, we have the chat feature open and you can put in your questions. We want to address questions. We have a limited amount of time. So we want to address questions that are more general. And if you have specific situations that you want to reach out to us about so we can help you through those, please, our contact information will be on screen at the end, and please feel free to contact us. And on the Google form, there's also going to be a spot for questions. And we have Heidi Pitkin here, my right-hand woman, who is going to be monitoring the chat and letting me know when there are questions, and we can bring those up. Just know that there's a lag in the chat feed on Google, so it might take a few minutes for us to get back to your question. So without further ado, have I forgotten anything, team? Okay, and I'm going to have my camera off so that unless I have a question, just to make sure we hopefully don't have technical issues. Okay, so here are our intentions for you today, for what we're going to learn and what we want to achieve in this process is to learn about some of the manifestations of on the autism spectrum, challenges, supports for students on the autism spectrum, learn about suicide risk and factors and prevention strategies, learning about Section 504 regulations and responsibilities, and learning about autism resources for further information on successful school outcomes for students on the spectrum. I'm going to turn the time over to Tanya. And I will scroll the slides for you.
So I get the privilege of starting with just giving you an overview of autism spectrum disorder. So we're kind of all on the same page. I think that's a good place to start. Those pictures, if you can go back, Holly. That's me in the middle there as a young teacher with one of the students that I taught. I was a teacher in the classroom for many, many years. I've been at the Utah State Board of Education now for 5 years, but I was autism specialist, inclusion specialist at Granite School District for about 10 years. And I worked at Pingree Center for Children with Autism. I've worked in the school districts. And these are all real people on the autism spectrum with varying skills, abilities, deficits that I've worked with and who I got permission from their parents and some of them directly from the person with autism to share their pictures. I just like to start with that so that we're looking at that, that group and not just thinking of a label, but of the people. So I like to start with that. So you can go to the next slide. Other way. Great, thank you. So just go back one more there, Holly Bell. There we go. So just that we're again on the same page, and I'm sure that much of the information that I'm going to be talking about today is not new to you. There might be some information that's new, but again, just sort of setting the stage for the conversation that Kathy and Holly will be having as well. Just making sure that we understand when we're talking about autism, it is a developmental disability. It can affect verbal, nonverbal communication and social interaction. And not always, but often does, affect their educational performance. So social communication, and then of course, there's some of those repetitive movements. Now that's just a tiny little sentence, maybe short paragraph. As you all know, there's a lot more to people that experience autism and what their stories are and their challenges and their abilities than what's summed up here, but just getting us all on the same page about what we're talking about. So you can go to the next slide. So here's just a few facts that I wanted to share with you. So currently the CDC reports about 1 in 54 children are diagnosed with autism. And then Utah is now 1 in 46, which just changed literally within the last week. We got new data from Utah Registry for Autism and Developmental Disabilities and the ADAM, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. But that number has changed. So it was very representative of the national number until our new numbers a week ago. So that just came out a week ago. And just so that you all know, that data is collected not just by medical diagnosis, but it's also collected through our public school special education classifications. So they take all that data. We've gotten permission through the Utah Department of Health to gather any kind of medical diagnosis. And then we've gotten permission through the Utah State Board of Education to gather data for students that are classified with autism that maybe don't have that medical diagnosis. And that's going to be about a third of our students that come up in that data. So they feel like they have a pretty good representation in terms of numbers, where some states aren't able to gather educational data. So I think it's pretty representative of what we have here in Utah. Males are 4 more times likely to be diagnosed with autism than females. And then I just always have to put this in here. I know this isn't anything new, but if you've met one person with autism, you've only met one person with autism. As I said, in my 32 years of working in education, with my primary focus on supporting those students, they all have a different story and different things to bring to the table. And then, of course, the needs and characteristics can really vary greatly. So the next slide. So I'm going to have Holly, she's going, as she mentioned, she's going to be sending out an email, and I'm going to actually send you out a link to the latest data that comes from that I was just mentioning, that says the 1 in 46, because it does give some IQ data here in Utah. It talks about, so that 1 in 46, just so that you know, is 8-year-olds. So that's the number here in Utah that they're talking about, is 8-year-olds. And then it's 1 in 109 for 4-year-olds. So it's kind of an interesting prevalence data that I will make sure and get a link to you, that just recently came out. And then I was trying to look at some IQ data is also included in that. And for me as a special educator, I find that interesting. So 27% at the age of 8 also had intellectual disability. So that's the kind of thing that I think that we find interesting to follow. And the 4-year-olds had 59% had an intellectual disability, which kind of leads to our next slide, which has to do with co-occurring conditions. There's a lot of information out there. And again, if you want further information, please contact me. But actually, the latest data shows that on average, a person on the spectrum has another 5 co-occurring conditions along with their diagnosis of autism. So some of the big ones are obviously depression, anxiety, OCD, attention deficit are some of those that I see often, and I'm sure you do as well. And then, like that I just mentioned, intellectual disability. So it's never a clear-cut case when we're talking about what supports these students might need. Okay, next slide. So, of course, autism is a disability, at least, when we talk about some of the deficits that they may be dealing with. In a minute, I'll talk about some of the unique abilities that this population may have, but just to make sure that we're all talking about the same sort of challenges we might see, obviously, social situations and etiquette, transitions, schedule changes. I did took some data several years ago in a classroom of first graders, and they did an average of 96 transitions a day for first graders. And part of the brain of autism, you know, one of the challenges is really keeping up with processing through changes, and 96 times a day would be very challenging. And so sometimes, you know, we see our students seeming non-compliant and maybe having some behavioral challenges. And I just like to make sure that people understand that sometimes that just really just has to do with they're trying to keep up. And if you're living sort of in a world of confusion, you can imagine what your life might be like with trying to always keep up. So communication, I mean, at the very heart of this disability is a communication disorder, communication processing. And in our schools, we often are expecting students to hear it once, move on and do it, and not giving them the time to really process what's been heard. So it's not just what they're communicating, which might seem inappropriate sometimes or confusing, but also how they're processing communication can really lead to so many challenges in school, in jobs, once they leave school, in relationships, paying attention. As I mentioned, that ADHD is a co-occurring condition for a lot of these students. So that can be a real challenge. I already talked about processing information. Obviously, if you're struggling with all of these other things, friendships can be challenging, personal space, emotional regulation, sensory regulation, academics. I'm sure you all know, I could talk about every one of these. I could probably spend 2 hours on each one of these situations that might be challenging for students. But just to let you know, these are kind of the things that I'm supporting students on the autism spectrum in these areas, and supporting their teachers with helping them and supporting their parents. Next slide. But then we also want to just talk about some of the things they excel at, right? Because I think if you've worked with anybody on the spectrum, you will know that there are some things that are outstanding skills that they might have that we might not necessarily see amongst, you know, the more neurotypical population. So attention to detail, memorization, really being, you know, able to follow specific directions. Again, I don't want to say that this is all of them, but, you know, oftentimes if you give a person on the spectrum the rules, or do, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they're going to do it perfectly and not miss a step. Of course, we've got sometimes those splinter academic skills where they just might be off the charts with their mathematical abilities or memorization abilities, might know every science fact there is to know about space. Logical thinking, again, when we're talking about abstract versus concrete, sometimes being logical is more of concrete thinking than abstract. So a lot of times we see them excelling in this area: honesty and reliability, the drive for perfection, thinking of different ways of problem solving, being dependable, and then thinking and learning in a visual way. Next slide. And then just again, some things that you might see with students on the spectrum, they might perseverate on a specific item or topic. So again, this can be positive or challenging, right? So if we're talking about somebody who really understands coding and you're out to dinner with, you know, family and friends, they don't all want to hear the specifics about coding. However, if they're employed somewhere where coding is the main thing that needs to be happening and going to make good things happen for that company, then you want them to be able to really focus and perseverate. The engagement in repetitive movements or routines. I think a lot of that, some of the research has kind of mentioned that might have to do with sort of self-calming, habits. We all have some of those to some degree, but for people on the spectrum, they might not understand that socially, your repetitive movement is making you stand out. So let's figure out something that's maybe a little bit more socially accepted, and but also helping to kind of regulate what you're going through. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier, maybe that concrete or literal thinking. So next one. So this is a really interesting topic for the autism world right now. And I think it's worth conversation, although I don't know exactly the best way to always address it. So we're talking about, I'm sure you've all heard those terms, high functioning and low functioning. I was in 3 meetings yesterday with people that were talking about autism, with very, very distinguished colleagues, with parents of people on the spectrum, students on the spectrum, and still the terms high functioning and low functioning are being used relatively on a consistent basis. However, I don't think anybody is denying that that's worth a discussion about what really is the best way to describe the autism spectrum or a person on the autism spectrum. And I think sometimes we feel very comfortable because we feel like if I say low functioning in a room, I'm not going to have to go through and describe what that might look like. If I say high functioning, like you in your mind are going to have some visual of that. But I think the conversations that we're having lately is that it's so hard to really sum that up. So I was sharing this with Holly the other day, a lot of times, so in those pictures that I showed you originally, there's a young man, and he gave me permission to talk about him and to show his photo. So he's in his 20s. His name is Josh, and he is what we would maybe have at one time used the term high functioning. So he's got a very high cognitive ability. He can, he could potentially function in a work situation. He could have all kinds of conversations with you if you wanted about politics. He's very, very intelligent about what's happening in the political world. But at this point, he is not able to go and work because socially, he's had the cops called on him for making inappropriate comments about politics, for threatening people about politics. So it's just so interesting. And then on the other hand, so we might say, oh, high functioning, but is he really high functioning? They've not been able to get him in a situation where he can work and be socially in an environment where he's not sort of getting himself into trouble. And then also on the other end of that spectrum, what we would maybe have once considered low functioning. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Carly Fleshman, but years and years ago, she's on Facebook, and I can send links to Holly about that too, to share with you. But she was like an 11-year-old that I would have considered, like probably IQ range. She was probably measuring in the 40s, so very low, and cognitively and adaptively. And right around when she was 11, she just started typing on the computer and was able to communicate. So how she knew so much more than anybody ever thought she did. And now she's written a book. She went to college. She's had some medical things that have come and, gotten in some of the way of her progression, but she can actually describe how it feels to have autism and why she bangs her head against the wall, because she feels like her body's going to explode or there's too much sensory input. So I, for years, would have been like, oh, yeah, that's low functioning. And I think just that case just really shook my world a little bit when I started reading more about her and experience. So I'm spending a lot of time on this, but I just think it is worth a conversation of understanding that high functioning and low functioning really are kind of what we're moving away from when we're talking about students on the spectrum. Okay, next slide. Okay, so again, just to mention that I am in special education. My whole career has been in special education. And I think especially for parents and maybe sometimes general educators, maybe sometimes administrators, there is some confusion about autism and special education. So I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this, but want to make sure that everybody here knows that there are many, many students that have an autism diagnosis that don't require any types of special education services. They may not require any services in our schools. And I have had that situation of where parents will come and say, okay, we got a diagnosis, we need special education. So there'll be a lot of teaching about what special education really is and how it could, hinder the student to actually to change up their curriculum and their standards and all of that. So here's, again, for those of you, many of you I'm sure know this, so they have to have a documented disability. That's one question that we have. Making it clear to you that that doesn't mean a medical diagnosis. So by documented, when we're talking about special education, that can come from the schools. Not a diagnosis, but if the school follows our rules and regulations, special ed rules and regulations, which there's a link here at the bottom of the slide, they can determine that a student classification is autism without a medical diagnosis through checklists and observational data, comprehensive testing, all of those kind of things. So if the team is determined they do have that disability, then does that disability really affect their progress in the gen ed setting? And then do they require specialized instruction to make progress? So that's when we're talking about, yep, it's going to be special ed. And just one more quick note on this. One thing that sometimes people don't understand is that communication and social interaction have to actually be documented as them not being able to make progress in the special or in the gen ed setting for autism to be appropriate. Holly, I see you popping on. Am I doing okay? You need to say something?
Oh, you're doing great.
Okay.
I was thinking I thought, we should contrast this with 504, and I thought to wait till my section, but why not do it now so that.
Well, and I think I've got 504 on the next slide.
Okay, good. And then if I feel like I need to make any clarifications, because there's things that you said about diagnoses and how that applies to 504, we definitely want to.
Okay, let's look at the next one, and then I want you to jump in.
Well, I'm sure you'll do great.
Okay, so then just again, when we're talking about students in special education or not special education, of course, these are some of the options. So you might have a student that's on the spectrum who needs no support other than all of our kids need support in the gen ed setting, right? I don't care. It's like this kid comes in hungry, this child's family's going through divorce, like they all need some level of support, but we're talking about, nothing outside of what you're going to give to sort of all students. And then the next thing that we see for many students on the spectrum would be the section 504. So where they're really kind of provided those accommodations and related services for all their educational needs. And as I think Holly put in here, on a case-by-case basis. And let me go through this and then I'll let you jump in. And then of course, then we get to an IEP where it's determined they do need that specialized instruction. And it might be in a regular or education class or special education classroom, or it could even, when we're talking about placement, go to special school. Sometimes we've got home and hospital, sometimes we've got residential treatment centers, and all of that placement discussion should be discussed in an IEP meeting. At every single IEP meeting, please. Don't just say, oh, now they're here, that's where they're staying. So Holly, did you want to add more to 504 here?
You did great. And I just, again, there does not need to be a diagnosis of ASD. It's all about stating need. And that limitation of there could be the child could be somewhere on the spectrum and it is limiting one or more major life activities. So there's a need there to help them to, to access their free appropriate public education and access the general ed curriculum. And so the word autism doesn't even need to appear anywhere on the 504 plan. And it's all about, from what you're saying with IDEA, they just need to have documentation that they've looked at whatever evidence that they have. So it sounds very similar. And with IDEA and 504, sometimes there's similarities and sometimes there aren't. And so I'm glad to clarify, but you did a great job. So
well, and I think that's a good point, Holly. And I do think while we are required through IDEA to classify, I definitely have students that have an autism diagnosis, but their needs might fall more under OHI or emotional disturbance or something along those lines. So we are tasked in special education with really finding out what is the primary disability that is interfering with their progress in the general ed curriculum. And so, yeah, I mean, and autism does not mean now here's your prescribed IEP. It's exactly like you said, 504, it's based on need. So we determined you have a need. Autism is a part of that, but as we develop the IEP, it's based on not because you have an autism diagnosis, but what are your needs? So
yeah. And so that's a really good point, that sometimes there's confusion that there should be categories under 504, and there aren't. There are no categories.
Yeah.
And there are with special education.
Yeah. Okay, I'm getting close to wrapping up here so that we can hear Kathy's great presentation. Just a couple things. Again, if I had 3 days to talk to you about this, I would show you some of these really fantastic videos about a few of the components of the brain that shape some of the autism type behaviors, characteristics that you might see. So definitely executive function deficits are often a challenge that our students, our people on the spectrum face. So things like organization, problem solving, like I mentioned, even just being able to shift your cognitive set. So I'm focused on this thing. So when I talked about transition, now I need to quickly move to this other thing. Those are, typically some struggles that we see with our students on the autism spectrum. And then theory of mind is just something that is fascinating. If you're really more interested in understanding what's going on in the autism brain, I would encourage you to look up theory of mind, watch this video. There's tons of stuff out there, but the idea behind it really has to do with perspective taking. And so the ability to understand that my brain, my thoughts, my experiences, my feelings are different than Kathy's. Like, so she went to Disneyland. She didn't ride all the same rides that I did. She didn't hate, Space Mountain. She didn't, get sick after eating 12 hot dogs or whatever. Like, being able to really understand that we all have different experiences and take different perspectives. And again, this is a totally spectrum thing. I'm not saying that everybody, on the spectrum of autism is terrible at theory of mind and understanding that, but it is a component that really interferes often with academics, with any kind of comprehension when we're talking about, okay, read this World War III story about being in a foxhole. World War III hasn't happened, but and so then they'd be like, wait, no, that hasn't even happened. And I've never been there. And how do I write about it? And so it can really interfere with relationships. And again, just being able to understand what the teachers are asking. And then central coherence is another thing that I like to talk about. So it sounds negative, but I don't mean to say it as negative. It's just the way that it's termed. But we say a lot of times people on the autism spectrum have what's called weak central coherence, which is they pay way more attention to detail. So I would say I have strong central coherence, which is not always a positive, because if I were to tell you a story, I'd be like, oh yeah, there was this thing that happened. I don't know, it was in some country. And I think like it was either 8,000 or 800,000 people died. I don't know what they died from. Like, I'm not very good at attention to detail. So I'm very good at giving the gist, right? I can tell you what the movie was about. Whereas maybe somebody on the spectrum could tell you line by line what was said in that movie. So it's not that one's better than the other, but it lends to different experiences for that person. So just a couple of things that I like to share. And I'm getting close, I promise. Next slide. Just as we're talking about interventions, one thing that I like to share with people that because I do a lot of technical assistance and professional development. This is kind of a cool pyramid by Ziggurat. And again, I can give you more information on this, but their theory is really that you want to, as you're going up with support or interventions, that you want to kind of start at this bottom of this pyramid. So if you think about right now, if you're hot, you're sick, you're cold, you didn't eat, you're having a harder time focusing on what I'm trying to present to you right now, right? And then we know that people on the spectrum often have some more intense sensory needs. So we really want to make sure that we're meeting those needs before we even try to tackle some of the challenges, some of the things that they might need to be taught. So then reinforcement, really reinforcing the skills, the things they are doing right and well and that are working for them in their world. Visual tactile needs, getting more into task demands. Like, are we expecting somebody on the spectrum to really understand the rules of the classroom when they're very literal and visual?
Tanya, we lost you. I think you're back.
Did I leave?
You did.
Oh my gosh.
We missed you. You said something about literal and visual, I think were the last words that you just said.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So just as you go up this table is just really understanding that, you know, are we asking, like when you get to task demands, we might assume that a student understands how to line up. Let's talk about first graders or something, and how to stand in line. Whereas many students that are maybe more neurotypical understand that just by watching. Are we expecting them to do a task that we've never actually taught them? It's just like if a student in kindergarten and I said, what's 2 + 2? And they said 5, I wouldn't be like, you're wrong. I'd be like, oh, wow, I really need to teach you how to do that, and so it's the same thing with some of these kind of social demands and expectations. That are we really asking them to do something they don't understand? And then the next step would be, that's where we start teaching them. Okay, next slide. I have hours and hours worth of trainings on this, but these are really some basic tips. I won't go into any detail on any of them, but again, I actually will share with Holly my presentation that goes through all of these that she can share with you. But just some things is really understanding that sensory issue that I talked about before. There's data right now that shows that handwriting, it's not that all the people on the spectrum decided they hate writing and they're going to get together and say we hate writing. There's actually data to show that the processing involved in that is very challenging for them to be able to process what they're supposed to do academically, and then to actually like make that into the movement, which becomes for most of us just automatic. Obviously reinforcing behaviors that are expected and appropriate, using their interest and passion. Student choice is huge for all kids. And I'd say actually every one of these things are good for all students. Making supports visual as much as possible. rather than expecting them to just process everything, with that verbal communication, giving concrete examples of expectations. I give the example of what's a clean desk? Clean out your desk. Take a picture of it, show them what it looks like. And then that same, like if you're at home, take a picture of what a clean room looks like. Don't just say, go clean your room. Plan for some of those executive function challenges that I talked about, support transitions, teach them to express when they need a break. Again, for anybody that's got some anxiety challenges, I suggest this. Keep language simple, because it can be confusing at times if we're using idioms or we're expecting them to process what we're saying. Teach students to ask for help. Again, this is kind of like that line up, like we expect everybody knows how to ask for help. They might not. Teach social expectations. And then I know that Holly's going to talk a little bit later about the person first language, and then the strength-based approach. Really, there's so many wonderful things that this population has to offer. So I just like to make sure that we start there. And I think that's it for me. Sorry to speed through it. It's a lot of info, but I want to get to Kathy's info.
Thank you so much for, I'm sorry, Holly, go ahead.
I wanted to do a follow-up real quick, but then I'm going to hand it over to you. I received a question, and the question is for 504, do you not put autism on the 504 plan? If you have a diagnosis of autism, you can certainly put that on the 504 plan, because if the parent brings that evidence in, or guardian, either by something a physician provided to them or just verbally, they say, my child has been diagnosed with autism, you state that in the plan, because really you're stating what evidence you've looked at. And so that is the evidence that you have, whatever the parent reports, or the guardian, the physician, you state what evidence you reviewed, because that's part of the process, is reviewing multiple sources of evidence. And then what you're addressing is the substantial, what life activity is substantially limited. So in using an example from what Tanya described, if they have difficulty with handwriting, then you talk about their handwriting is substantially limited. And so as such, we are going to provide such and such accommodations. Or a child, they're even socially, they're substantially limited. And so what kind of accommodations are you going to provide to help with that limitation? So if you have a diagnosis, fine, you can write that in there. That's not necessarily explaining the need, because as we're talking and we're saying all the individual differences for a student with autism who is on the spectrum and potentially does not need any accommodations, they're not going to, they're individuals that are going to have different needs, and it's a case by case basis. So hopefully that clarifies. And of course, I'm happy to follow up with that. So I'm going to hand it over to Kathy.
Well, thank you so much, Holly, and thank you, Tanya, for setting the stage for me and giving the background about perseveration and some other things that you see within the autism spectrum population. So just at the outset, I just looked at the most recent data that we have with regards to children that are on the autism spectrum. They're 28 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts compared to their peers. And then Tanya mentioned the fact that children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder have a comorbid mental health diagnosis. So they could be experiencing their autism and have additional problems with anxiety or depression. So as I talk about suicide prevention, I want you to understand the multidimensional, multifaceted nature of dealing with kids. And when you're dealing with kids, you have to deal with them and meet them where they are. So if you go on to the next slide. Okay, this is my daughter's graduation picture. She graduated in 2020. And the reason I wanted to have this here is you can see that she's in my car and we're looking through the windshield. And so I want to set this up by giving you this scenario. So if we can imagine suicide prevention as driving a car, then the statistics are what we see out of the rear view mirror. It's important to look in the rear view mirror to know what's behind us, but what we ought to be focused on is what we see through the windshield, and that's hope. And I will always lead out with hope, because when parents receive a diagnosis that their child is on the autism spectrum, you have to frame it in the way that there are so many possibilities for them, that they see the world differently. And that's not good, that's not bad, it's just the way that they see the world. So if you'll go on to the next slide. Suicide's really complex. And when people want to drill it down to one factor, I say you've got to realize that there's no single cause, that there's multiple layers acting on one another. And it most often occurs when stressors and health issues converge to create this experience of hopelessness and despair. And we're going to talk about this in the slides to come, about just that experience of experiencing intense emotion and what that's like in your body and what that feels like physiologically. Risk factors includes health, your environment, and also history. So if you'll go into the next slide, Holly. What I like to do is compare this to a puzzle or a Rubik's Cube. It's not just one single factor as to why suicide happens. There's the thoughts of suicide, that's access to means such as firearms or medications, a bottle of Tylenol, isolating, withdrawing, untreated depression, loss of hope, and then drinking or drug use. So go on to the next slide. So what it really is, it's not that we have no control. We just need to know how to build a different cube for our kids, how to infuse more protective factors in their lives, how, when they're hopeless, how can we give them that feeling of hope again? And then when they are so frustrated, so overwhelmed, the sensory overload is way too much for their little bodies, how can we give them some coping skills? And what about healthy habits? Preventing access to guns, not even having guns in your home. And then I really want to emphasize that connection to peers and trusted adults is so essential. And finally, treatment for depression, whatever that looks like. So if you'll go into the next one. Your role in suicide prevention, hopefully today, is I can demystify things for you and let you know that you have the abilities within you to help someone get through and navigate a really hard storm. When we talk about COVID, it's like we're all in this same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. So you need to keep that in mind when you're dealing with the students, especially those that are on the autism spectrum disorder, that you've got to stay in that boat with them. And you know, the boat might rock, but you stay in the boat and you help them navigate through the storm. So even though it's complicated, suicide is largely preventable. And so in the next slides, I hope to give you just a background of what the experience of the autistic individual is like and the skills that we can use in an intervention with them. So if you'll go into the next slide, Holly. And then the next slide. So what I did is I wanted to give you an idea, and this is out of a book from Lisa Morgan from the book called Living with PTSD on the Autism Spectrum. And I'm going to read this directly so that you understand. Lisa is on the spectrum, and she says, I believe suicide ideation is within the minds of many people diagnosed with autism, and especially if they have post-traumatic stress disorder as well. It's not an inherent characteristic of autism. It's a result of living in a NT neurotypical world with a diagnosis of autism. It's not belonging. It's being misunderstood at the deep level of self. Understanding the truth and having to become someone you're not in order to be accepted by society in general can develop into this intense rejection of who you are, which can result in suicide ideation. And so I really like the way that she worded this. So keep in mind, folks, that on the autism spectrum, you're going to experience the world differently from your peers. And with that, sensory difficulties like sight, sound, smell, touch are going to be more intense. And then they may not know how to cope with emotions, or they may act in a way that's not typical, like laughing instead of crying. So go on to the next slide. So if you're a youth living with autism, this comes from a mother of a 13-year-old child. And she says, my child was 13 years old and he'd never in his entire life been invited to a friend's birthday party, although he had been invited to family ones. His brother, on the other hand, had so many friends and had been to so many, I can't count them all. I know that really bothered both of my children. The autistic one who never got invited, and the brother who hurt for his sibling who never got an invitation. So trying to unpack your child's experience, when your child that is experiencing autism doesn't have the words or doesn't know how to identify the emotions, can be really tricky. And so this is where you have to meet them where they are. So on the next slide, I'm going to go through some of this as to what the research says. So the research has shown that high rates of suicidality in autism spectrum conditions, but there's a lack of research as to why. And parents of children who live with autism spectrum disorder suspect it's probably the lack of social skills and the lack of connections with friends may play into the risk factors. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the data that Tanya initially introduced at the beginning of this webinar, and this is coming from the Utah Registry of Autism and Developmental Disorders. She was talking about some data regarding 8-year-olds. Well, this is data regarding autism in 16-year-olds. So this would be your high school population around 10th grade, maybe going into 11th grade. And once again, females with autism, and remember, females, you're not going to see as many females with autism as you will males, but they're at 3 times higher risk than the general public for suicide ideation. And 8% of 16-year-olds have shown evidence of suicidal behavior. 55% of 16-year-olds with autism and an intellectual disability exhibit signs of suicidal behavior. 58% of 16-year-olds with autism have suicide and depression. And then 42% of 16-year-olds with autism have suicidal behavior without depression. And so no two situations are going to be the same. And so you really have to take each situation independently. If you go on to the next one, you really, I think what it is, and I talk a lot about it, this spidey sense that you almost have to develop as you're working with kids through the years. Is this autism spectrum disorder symptoms, or is this a mental health condition? So what you need to do is recognize that in terms of communication, there is that inability to express emotions and to communicate them well, a real difficulty asking for help and even knowing if they need help. Then in terms of cognition, and Tanya did a great job of explaining that frontal lobe deficits of executive function, not being able to, really understand how to make decisions and act and process in a rapid way. Processing time is oftentimes a lot slower. In terms of repetitive thinking, you do get this perseveration, and that perseveration is usually negative thoughts. And so if you're perseverating and you are having all these negative thoughts swirling, having to shift those thoughts is really difficult because you have these thinking patterns, like neurons that wire together, fire together. It's just that well-worn path for those thinking patterns, and they tend to be really rigid. So then in terms of social support, reaching out for help is just this social skill that just doesn't come easily. It's like they feel that they should know this already, that they should understand, or there may be this just hesitancy to ask for help. So if you'll go on to the next slide. So is this ASD or mental health that's driving this suicidal and self-harm thinking? So you really have to say, is this the anxiety? Is this depression? Is this just repetitive thinking, rigidity, compulsive thinking patterns? So this is where you have to really work one-on-one with the child and kind of intuit what's going on for them and unpack it all. In the next slide, we're going to give you some skills about that. So warning signs, this is where you are going to go ahead on to the next slide. I'll go through them with you. Is it just the autism or is this a warning sign? So what you need to do is really ask yourself these 4 questions. And the first one being, what is it that you're hearing? So it may not be what you're hearing, but what are you seeing and what are you experiencing verbally and non-verbally with this child? Dig deeper to find those true warning signs. Are you overshadowing the diagnosis of autism? Are you saying, oh, this is just the autism? So be really cognizant of that and not disregard that there may be warning signs showing up. And is the student masking and trying to look neurotypical? And what are some unmet needs? There's a 4-letter acronym I use with kiddos all the time, and it's HALT, H-A-L-T. And I look at physical needs first and foremost. Are they hungry? Are they angry? Are they lonely? Are they tired? Have they met those physical needs? And you work from the base and then you go upwards from there. And if you go on to the next one, you want to look at the general warning signs, and it's withdrawal, feeling trapped. And I put just another one with substance use, just for the means of that self-medication piece that oftentimes comes into play. So autistic people withdraw for self-care. They withdraw for pretty much self-preservation. And it's kind of like their time to downshift from having to combat all this stimuli coming at them. Why are they withdrawing? Is there too much sensory stimulation? And the warning signs really don't always fit. They may feel trapped. They may feel trapped in their autism, trapped in how society views autistic people. And so you have to unpack that story and what that looks like. And then finally, acting reckless. If you'll go back to the next one, just, oops, we just need to go back twice. And one more. Okay, just acting reckless and risky activities may be a clue that the individual's stimming, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, and what is going on for the autistic person. So the next slide is talking a little bit about anxiety, agitation, and sleep. And these are some things that can be controlled, although it's going to be something that it's going to be a real struggle. 40% of autistic adults have an anxiety disorder. Is there a difference? What does it look like? And then sleep is also an aspect of autism. Kids on the spectrum have a trouble sleeping anyway. And so you have to just be really discerning. So on the next slide, we're going to talk to you about some things that are resources. So these are 2 resources that we will follow up on your listserv and give you these links to these 2 key resources. And these have just come out in the last 2 years. And this first one is just a resource for the warning signs of suicide. and special considerations for the autism community. And it's written and developed by Lisa Morgan and other specialists in this area. So if you go on to the next slide, I really want to make sure that you're well versed with the policies for your school, for your charter school. And in terms of prevention, we have changed this language over the years, but this is the last iteration of the Utah Code for Suicide Prevention. And what we are trying to do with suicide prevention is include programs and training to address bullying, cyberbullying, prevention of youth suicide, the increased risk of suicide amongst the LGBTQIA youth, youth suicide intervention after suicide. How can we reach out to families, students, faculty, underage drinking of alcohol, methods of strengthening the family, and methods of strengthening the youth relationship in the school and the community. So you can see that suicide prevention's multifaceted. It's all about wellness. It's all about getting hooked into those supports that you need. And if you are on the spectrum, you may need additional supports. So go on to the next one, because this is a question on this next slide, Holly, that I get quite a bit.
So before I do, Heidi says there is something that popped up in the chat that says,
Okay.
we ask and then tech. Does that sound familiar? V, lowercase v, and then uppercase ASK, and then uppercase TEC and lowercase h. Does that sound familiar to anyone?
VS Tech?
V ask tech.
I am not familiar with that.
Okay, so maybe we can get more information in the chat and we'll follow up on it.
Okay, that'd be great. But in this next slide, you do have permission to ask a student questions related to youth suicide prevention, intervention, postvention. And intervention just means any effort to prevent a student from attempting suicide. And then postvention means the intervention after a suicide attempt or a death to prevent or contain contagion. And going on to the next slide. I think I gave that to you. So one thing that I like to emphasize is the fact that we do this opposite. We try and change the behavior first and then change the emotional state when you have to do it in this order. So change that emotional state first. If you have a child that's perseverating, that's having a meltdown, don't try and approach that behavior without addressing the emotion first. Do you have a weighted blanket that you can provide for them so that they can do that self-soothing? Or what are some things that help them regulate their emotions first? Then you can address the behavior. And so I think this is really helpful advice, because this is something that a lot of people want to rescue and try and change that behavior right away. You got to change the emotion first. And that's hard to identify because they may not know how to verbalize how they're feeling. So on the next slide, these are some things that I'm going to give you a script, because a lot of folks, they say, well, Kathy, I don't know what to say. So I'm going to tell you what not to say. So don't tell them everything's going to be okay, because it may not be. It's not okay. Nothing's okay. In the moment, if you're telling them that it's all going to be okay, they're very literal and they're saying, I'm not okay. I don't get that. And then you have so much to be thankful for. So for me, suicide ideation is not a feeling or a personal fault. It's this intrusive thought that's going on in my brain. So change that idea that you have so much to be thankful for. Well, they don't get it. And you just need to think about good things. Well, if you perseverate around negative thoughts, you really can't downshift and get into the positive very readily. That's not going to help. It's like telling a person who's paralyzed that if they think enough about good things, they will be able to get up and walk. So I hope this helps, because this was written by someone on the autism spectrum that really thinks literally, and these are not helpful. So this is hurtful. So what's helpful is the following. You matter. With all the negative thoughts swirling around in the mind of someone with suicide ideation, hearing that they matter can make a huge difference in the way they view themselves in the moment. I care about you. Telling someone that they're cared for is one of the best things to say. You're making a connection to the person in need. And then you ask directly. You don't beat around the bush. You say, what do you need? It's a reminder to the person reaching out that they're being thought of as a person who's strong enough to share what they need in the moment, instead of being thought of as a weak person, incapable of thinking for themselves because the brain is being uncooperative with thoughts of suicide. So on the next slide or two, I'll tell you some ways that are real simple using your hand. And this is really good for your littles. It's a way to pace your breathing. So when I talk about changing the emotion first, then dealing with the behavior, use some breathing techniques to just breathe in. And then as you circle down through the thumb, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out, and you can do lots of different repetitions. If this is something that's hard for them, if they're stimming at the time and they can't do that, I mean, this is something that you just try different things. If you just want to breathe with them, then you can do that as well. So the next one is another strategy that when you're in distress, a lot of us stim. And what it is just repetitive movements and behaviors. It's kind of self-stimulating because it's a way of trying to communicate with your nervous system and trying to calm it down. It's either for regulation or for enjoyment, or just to help you calm down. If there's a sensory insult, whether it's just noises or lights or, just something coming, it helps them focus. So oftentimes you'll notice that your students may pace a lot because they don't really have the words. It's just, these are kind of the early signs of overwhelm. And it's kind of the linchpin of how to get through a crisis moment is I'm just going to move my body and try and get through this crisis and work through it. And going on to the next one, I think is you, Holly. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and I'll turn the time over to Holly to take us home for the rest of this webinar.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Okay, so we're going to talk about Section 504 now. And if you have participated in webinars that I've given in the past, you're going to see familiar material that I am going to present every time. And so if you find yourself thinking, Holly, you have said this so many times before, that's great, because that means that you learned it. But this might be new information to some, and it's really, really critical in following the regulations. So students with disabilities, so this is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act 1973. This is the prohibiting discrimination for students with disabilities. So all students with disabilities, including those who qualify under IDEA. So they fall under the Civil Rights Act protection of 504, Section 504, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in all school programs and activities in public schools receiving direct or indirect federal funding. This is all school programs and activities. It is designed to provide equal access and fairness in general education to students with disabilities through their 504 accommodation plan. Okay, so I always bring up child find. This is a law. It's a legal requirement under both, actually you'll find the language under IDEA, and it applies to 504. This is our legal responsibility to identify, locate, and evaluate students who potentially might need services and entitled and to be entitled to services and accommodations under Section 504 IDEA. This is the responsibility of all educators to actively seek out these students. And so in this sense, we are all on watch at all times for all students, regardless of, in pre-K through 12, regardless of where they're at. So if they are homeschooled, if they are in a private school, even if they, any child that you might see could potentially need services, it's our obligation to refer them. It doesn't mean that we are going to be providing the services, but this is about finding them and making sure that they're able to access those services. So here are some things, these were brought up before, specifically by Tanya, and also Kathy brought up some warning signs. So these are the things that when we're looking to identify these children, some red flags to be aware of. Looking at social situations. And so how are they in their social interactions, in transitions from one to the other, whether it be in the curriculum, in the classroom curriculum, whether it be any sort of transition. A lot of our children on the spectrum struggle with making those transitions and changes, any changes. And so any behavioral expectations that they're not able to meet, their communication, are they able to communicate their emotions, their needs, their attention, how they're processing information or directions, friendships, personal space. They might need more of a bubble in relation to others. And are they able to regulate their emotions? And this is hard with our adolescents, right? I don't know how many of them can regulate their emotions, let alone this adult woman. So this is something to look for, and also sensory regulation. So do you see them stimming? And then academics, sometimes will impact their academics, but not always, because remember, when we're talking about what is substantially limiting, we don't always look at learning. We have to look at how the student is being impacted by one or more major life activities. So for instance, sleep. Kathy mentioned sleep. This is a major life activity. If it's impacting their sleep, it could potentially, it's a red flag. And we're not diagnosing autism, right? Right? Okay, remember that. And these students are significantly more at higher risk for bullying. And that I read in the research over and over again, that our students on the autism spectrum experience more bullying and disciplinary action. And when we're seeing bullying, this is a discrimination law. And so our students, any student by disability, who identifies as having a disability, who is being bullied at school, they're being discriminated against and they are protected under Section 504. So look at disciplinary action, because if these students aren't able, their behavioral expectations, like the expectations we have on them with their behavior and emotional regulations, if they're kind of outside of our expectations, that's a red flag. This should trigger child fine. So this is the requirement for eligibility under Section 504. A student is eligible for a Section 504 accommodation plan if an evaluation shows that the student has a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities or major bodily functions. And I think we've talked enough about that. Okay, so what are some of the life activities? I've mentioned some. So we've talked about sleeping, speaking. Again, we don't overfocus on learning, concentrating, communicating, self-care, sitting, interacting with others. So some of these probably jump out at you as some that you might associate more with a student who is potentially on the spectrum. Okay, so here are some potential accommodations. So if just a reminder how this works. So child find is triggered. you make a referral for an evaluation. You put together a team of student or people who are knowledgeable of the child. Hopefully that involves the parent or guardian. If not, the team needs to be comprised of individuals who are knowledgeable of this child. You put together a team, you look at all the evidence you have available. And so, as I mentioned before, you might have documentation from a physician. You might, you'll have what is being communicated by the parent or guardian, if they have any of that available, what the teachers are saying, whatever you have, you put that on the table, you evaluate and make a determination if this child is substantially limited and meets the eligibility as a student for a student with a disability under Section 504, and do they need an accommodation plan in order to access their free and appropriate public education. So you're here, you've done all that, you have determined that this student is eligible, and so you're trying to put together a plan. These are potential accommodations. In all cases with Section 504, case by case basis. And we've talked about all the different, it's a spectrum. So you're going to have a spectrum of how this looks like for our students. And so it needs to be individualized. All plans need to be individualized. So these are just some thoughts. And I borrowed these from Tanya and from research that, or Tanya, sorry, from the research that I have done. So remember, this is, and on some of this related to 504, I want you to remember that this is all programs and activities in the educational setting. So when I looked through case law, and because the Office for Civil Rights oversees Section 504, and when I looked for case law and OCR findings, the things that came up the most is that these students were not invited to participate in field trips, especially those who were in self-contained classrooms, were not invited to participate in field trips, or they required the parent or guardian to be there. That's not legal. You need to accommodate them in all programs and activities during school, after school, anything related that is offered to general education students. And you need to be providing those accommodations, not the parents. And then consider their sensory issues. How can you help them manage any of that personal space that they need, or what is it that just gets under their skin, and how can we accommodate that and help them regulate that so they can focus on education? Providing handwriting alternatives, building in opportunities for student choice. And, when we're looking at universal design for learning, this is something, what benefits the one child. So I know I said it's individualized, but in this concept, what benefits the one child benefits all. And this is an example where we're saying student choice, this ability for a student to be a participant in their education is good for all. And so with our students who are on the spectrum, allowing them to have choices will help them to participate more in the education environment. Supporting those transitions, allowing breaks, and then having a crisis plan. So when we see these behaviors, so these externalizing behaviors that happen with Tanya's story, I'm trying to think about her student who is now in their 20s, and they would get mad and they would react. And so having a crisis plan in place so that they're not automatically going to disciplinary action. And so, and you've got to address and prevent bullying of these students. So this is something, a case law that I found, it's an OCR resolution that you have to address and prevent bullying. A district may violate Section 504 if it has adequate notice that a student-on-student harassment based on disability is occurring and fails to take prompt and effective action to stop it, to remedy the effects of the harassment and prevent its recurrence. So that's just a caution to you to make sure you act on those things. Now, I just want to spend the last part of our time together to talk about celebrating and honoring the neurodiversity in our population of students who are on the spectrum. And as Tanya talked about, we're dealing with fascinating brains in our students who are on the spectrum. And so when we're talking about inclusion of these students in the school environment, make sure everything is accessible to them. So whatever we can do to structure the environment, to structure their education, to make sure it's accessible to them, we need to focus on that. We need to, so when we're talking about bullying, interrupting bullying, that includes verbal harassment and any language that we're hearing, and this is for all of our students with disabilities. If we're hearing derogatory language being directed, disrespectful language being directed at our students with disabilities, we need to stop it. And we need to make sure that students know what is appropriate and what is not appropriate language. So we don't use the R word, and we don't use autism and autistic in a disrespectful way. And then don't use different ability or special ability. Please avoid those terms. And don't make an assumption about their abilities. So Tanya mentioned this. Every child is different. So we don't, if you've met one autistic student, you've met one autistic student. So we don't want to make an assumption that all students on the spectrum have the same abilities. All of our students are different. So we see similar characteristics that can arise, but they're all individuals. And so, as Tanya mentioned, I think in the research that I've been doing and the conversations that I've been hearing, that there is a community that is having these conversations, this autistic community that are saying, we don't like the labels high functioning and low functioning. And the reason behind that is because if you say I'm high functioning, you're essentially saying, oh, they're okay. They're high functioning. And so they don't need a Section 504 plan, or they're going to be okay. They are still have struggles, and as a result of their disability, and they don't want that to be minimized. And then, or they don't want them to be disregarded. And then as far as minimization, if you say they're low functioning, then you don't have those high expectations or expectations that you can have for what their capabilities are. So you're minimizing what their strengths are. So that's what the conversation is around high functioning, low functioning. And you are going to continue to hear it and hear these conversations, but they're not living with autism. They are, this is them. This is their life. And it's not that they're living with it. This is their life experience. This is their lived experience. I don't know that I'm making any sense, but just be careful of using that term. Okay, and so as Tanya said, alluded to this person first versus identity first language. So you might hear just in the disability community that there's this desire to focus on person first language. And that's something at the Utah State Board of Education. We want to put the individual first and not the disability. So the student first and not the disability. And this is something that is a conversation in the disability community. Now I've heard, and the more I look, the more I dig in, there's also conversation happening around identity first language, where some people with autism prefer to be called autistic person. And so, I do a lot of trainings around different identities of students, and I really just want to default to let the person identify themselves. So, and it's okay to do that. We don't have to try to guess. We don't have to, try to assume. I think you can maybe default to person with autism, but understand that some individuals on this autism spectrum prefer to be identified with disability first language, that they are an autistic person. And so that's just something to keep in mind. And disrupting and addressing bullying. So we don't want any of our students to be discriminated against based on their disability. And please be inclusive. So best practices and universal supports for children with autism in the regular classroom provide them with a chance to practice their communication skills with others in the class. So let's not separate them out and assume that they don't have these social skills. They need practice, they need exposure and structure around that. So just give them some time to develop friendships and see how peers behave in day-to-day classroom situations. Have those expectations, those high expectations for all staff members and students, and promote feelings of acceptance through a welcoming school atmosphere. This is how does our whole school feel for all students, but how does it feel for our students with disabilities? Are we including them and making sure we're extending that effort to include them? And that should be in our values, our policies, and just what kind of behaviors do we expect in the classroom? So I really like this quote. Peers benefit by having students with autism in their classroom. When peers of children with autism are educated about autism and are given an opportunity to act as peer tutors or buddies, they learn acceptance and empathy, act as role models, and become more aware of individual strengths and weaknesses. We want our students to embrace the diversity that we have around us. And that includes our students who have disabilities, who are on the autism spectrum. We're not doing them any favors. They are benefiting by having these children around them. And so they're lucky when they get to interact with a student with autism. So these are just my, like I said, well, the things that Holly says over and over and over again. When you are looking at a student who potentially needs 504 accommodations, there is no requirement for response to interventions. There's no intervention period that is required. That might be different under special education. Under 504, the wait and see. If you have a reasonable amount of information that this child might need accommodations, you don't have a window of time that you have to provide interventions before evaluating. So once you have that notice, once you have a referral, you have 45 school days in order to quit. You can do the interventions within those 45 days, but don't wait and see if you have some significant reason to suspect that this child might have a disability. And then, like I always say, a diagnosis, one diagnosis, and I think Tanya alluded to this, that doesn't mean because a child has a diagnosis of autism that they qualify under 504 or under IDEA. So considering multiple sources of evidence, I talked about the 45 days. The 504 team has to be knowledgeable of the student. So it's great if you have professionals that can, who like Tanya, who has experience and knowledge of autism, but Tanya doesn't know your kids. So you can't invite Tanya to be on the team because she doesn't know this child. She doesn't see this child every day in the educational environment. So, but it's great for you to have someone to consult who is aware of autism and potential needs of children. And then please, you don't need an IEP and a 504 plan. No, one or the other. And then no medical diagnosis is required. And going back to that doctor's note or whatever, also tell your parents, okay, you brought me a diagnosis. Thank you for that information. We're going to need to do an evaluation with multiple sources of evidence, but I appreciate that you've done that. Because a lot of the time they'll just say, hey, now you need to put my child on a 504 plan. No, that's not how it works. So did you learn about manifestations, challenges, and sports for students on the autism spectrum? Check. Participants, did you learn about suicide risk factors and prevention strategies? Check. And and did you learn about Section 504 regulations and responsibilities? Hopefully, yes. And then did you learn about autism resources? For further information on successful school outcomes for students on the spectrum, and we will be sending some of those out. Yes, they were mentioned, but we'll make sure that you have links and resources and things. I will send those out on the 504 listserv, and who knows where you got information on this. Okay, we've got, look, lots of references and resources. See, success criteria met. And here we are. So all sending things out on the listserv, and Kathy and Tanya will, but take this information down if you're not on any of our radar. So if you want to see this PowerPoint, you want to, you're an educator, you need to relicense your points, and you're going to fill out the Google form. Great. So anything you need, follow-up questions, there it is, right at 3:30. I am done. And so thank you to all of you who participated. Happy Friday, happy winter, and I hope you enjoy the celebrations of the season. And Kathy and Tanya, any last words?
Just thank you, everyone. Thank you, Holly, for inviting me to participate, and Kathy, such great information as well as what Holly shared. So have a great holiday season.
You too. Take care, everyone.
All right. Be well, folks.